This workbench is the perfect starting point for any beginning woodworker and could easily be the only workbench you need, regardless if you're more of a power tool woodworker versus a hand tool woodworker. This bench has a solid core door top with a dimensional lumber base, which makes for a sturdy yet easy to build workbench, and it's also chock full of storage with a bank of 12 drawers. The bench also features a vise and dog holes for work holding, and its size makes it perfect for use as both a workbench and an outfeed table. Best of all, I ditched all my fancy tools for this project and went back to basics using standard job site tools, which most of you probably already have. And now let's see how I built this thing. As always, I started by designing the workbench in SketchUp, and this design is similar to my first workbench, which I built 9 years ago as the first project on this channel. I started by cutting the parts I needed for the legs, and rather than using my fancy new miter saw station to break down the parts, I used a combination of a circular saw and job site table saw. And while this wasn't as speedy, I still ended up with my parts cut accurately to size. The legs on this bench are made from laminated 2x6s, and by spacing the pieces during the glue up, I could also create the half lap joints where the stretchers will connect to the legs. And I've used this technique on a lot of my workbenches in the past, and it works great, but it does require an absolutely ridiculous number of clamps if you want to clamp all of your legs at once. Once the glue had dried, I ripped the legs down to their final width of 3.5 inches, which cut off the rounded factory edges and left me with much nicer looking parts. And this cut pretty much maxed out this job site saw, but thankfully it just managed to make the cut. Next, I got my long stretchers cut to size using my circular saw, and then I ripped them to width at the table saw, again removing those rounded factory edges for tighter half laps. Once that was done, I could add some glue to the half laps and get the stretchers permanently attached to the legs. I cut the stretchers oversized so that I had some wiggle room during the assembly process, and this made the glue up a lot less stressful. I repeated the process for the rest of the long stretchers, and as you can see, some of these pieces were pretty twisted, but thankfully this twist was easy to fix during the assembly process. As you can see, there's just a little bit of a twist in this thing, but I assure you it's really not going to matter. Pretty much all of that twist is in this one board, and I can flex that into place, barely putting any pressure onto it. Once the glue dried, I finished up the stretchers with my new Japanese Roubo saw, which is made by Suizan. Next, I cut the short stretchers, which connect the two sides of the bench, and then I could get the base assembled. I used through dowel joinery to connect the short stretchers to the legs, and this makes for an incredibly strong joint without the need for any fancy tools. I started by adding 3 long screws, which held the stretchers in place temporarily, then I could come back and add the dowels. I used 1/2-inch oak dowels and added way too much glue in the first hole. Whoa, that was way too much glue. So don't do that. So much that the hydraulic pressure actually cracked the stretcher slightly. Thankfully, since it was already overflowing with glue, I could just clamp the stretcher back together, and I made sure to add glue to the dowels instead of to the holes moving forward. I flushed up the dowels with my flush trim saw and left the center screw in place for the time being so it could hold the joint together while the glue dried, which eliminated the need for longer clamps. If you want to see a deep dive on all the details of this workbench, including a 16-part video series and detailed plans, I'd love for you to check out my first woodworking course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. This Woodworking 101 style course was built based on my decade of woodworking experience, and I basically made the course I wished existed when I was getting started on my woodworking journey. The course includes way more than just this workbench build though. Along with videos going through my entire tool list, I'll have another entire build series covering this modern coffee table as part of the course, and we'll also go over designing projects in 3D, including some SketchUp basics, and much more. Best of all, I kept the tools used on the builds to an absolute minimum, based on my essential tools list, so you should be able to follow along at home, even if you're limited on tools. My Jumpstart Your Woodworking course is in early access until June 14th, with the price reduced by 50% while I finish the coffee table build series. So if you want to grab my course at the cheapest price it'll ever be, check it out now by clicking the link in the video description below, and thanks so much for your support. After adding the dowels, I added a little wood filler to any of the gaps in the legs, which are pretty much inevitable since I didn't use my jointer or planer to flatten these pieces prior to the glue up. The next day I got started by installing the inner stretchers, which span between the long stretchers and help to support the top. I decided to try some DIY pocket holes here, again to show this work can be done without a ton of fancy tools, and while this worked pretty well, I think a pocket hole jig would have made this a whole lot easier. And that turned out to be true because I couldn't resist grabbing my pocket hole jig for the stretchers for the bottom shelf. As you can see, I set these stretchers down 1.5 inches below the top edge of the long stretchers, and this will allow me to install the rabbited boards which will make up the bottom shelf. I installed all 3 stretchers and then came back and added blocking between the stretchers, which is where the shelf boards will be attached. Speaking of the shelf boards, next I could get started on those. After cutting them to length, I could cut the rabbet onto each long edge, starting with the boards in the vertical orientation. Next, I changed my setup to make the cuts on the faces of the boards, and this cut finishes the rabbet on each long edge. And these rabbeted areas allow the shelf boards to overlap, and by leaving a small gap between each shelf board, the boards will have room to expand and contract seasonally. Once all the rabbets were cut, I could get the shelf boards installed with 2 screws at each end. I made a quick drilling jig to keep the hole spacing on each board consistent, and this just makes everything look a little nicer in the finished install. After drilling and countersinking the holes, I got the shelf boards installed, starting from the center and working my way out. I used 3-inch screws, which were kind of overkill, but I had a huge bucket left over from the shop renovation, so I figured, why not? The shelf boards were spaced 1/8 of an inch from each other and 1/8 of an inch from the long stretchers, and again, this spacing leaves room for seasonal movement. I used my favorite spacers here, and I'll link to them in the video description, and I seem to use them on almost every project these days, and definitely recommend picking up a set. Okay. The last board on either end of the shelf needed to be trimmed to fit, and I made sure to leave room for the same 1/8 of an inch gap when making these cuts. With that, the bottom shelf was installed, and next I got the workbench base moved to the floor to cut the notch for the vise. Good God. Good God. Heavy. Okay, there we go. And I could have cut this notch with a variety of tools, but the vise will be mounted directly to this notched area, so I wanted to ensure the cut was nice and straight. With that in mind, I made the cut with my inexpensive Wind track saw, which I did an entire video on. I finished the notch cut with my jigsaw, and with the notch cut, I could get the workbench base prepped for finish. Whoop. I started by sanding the entire base with 80 grit sandpaper, flushing up the through dowels and cleaning up any tool marks. Then I came back and added a chamfer to all of the edges of the bench. And there's nothing more annoying than banging a knuckle into a sharp corner while working on a project, and because of this, I always make sure there are no sharp edges left on my shop projects. I also chamfered the bottom of the legs, which will help to keep them from chipping when dragging the bench around on my concrete floor. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, FlexiSpot and their E7 Plus, this 4-leg standing desk base. I personally use a FlexiSpot E7 standing desk as my main desk every day, but this E7 Plus is going in my shop where it'll be used as an adjustable height work table.
A little over 51 inches.
The E7 Plus is a whole new level of standing desk. The 4 legs make the base extremely sturdy, and with a lifting capacity of 440 pounds, it can handle the heaviest desk setups. The keypad on the desk makes it easy to set height presets, and I figured out you can run this desk with a battery inverter, so it doesn't even need to be plugged into a wall outlet.
This is absolutely crazy. I'm like 210 pounds, FYI, so let's go up. Yes. That is ludicrous. I could literally work on the ceiling on top of this thing.
Best of all, the E7 Plus comes in at a super reasonable price, especially compared to other 4-leg standing desks on the market. So if you're looking for a great new standing desk or work table, check out the E7 Plus by clicking the link in the video description below. Also, make sure to use my coupon code to get an extra $50 off your standing desk purchase today. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. After chamfering, I finished sanding the base with 120 grit, and once that was done, I could get the vise blocking installed. And this blocking will fill the gap between the long stretchers and the edge of the workbench, and this was just 2 chunks of 2x material glued together and then screwed in place on the long stretcher. With that, the base was ready for finish, and I went with paint here. And as you know, if you've seen some of my other shop projects, I love to add a little pop of color on these kinds of pieces, and in this case, I just mixed up a bunch of colors of leftover paint I had on hand. And as luck would have it, I ended up with a color almost identical to Makita's signature teal, and I personally really like the look. Once the finish dried, I decided to go ahead and mount the quick release plates for the workbench casters while I had the base up on the solid core door, and this was as easy as tapping a few holes where the plates needed to be mounted, and these tapped holes are surprisingly strong even in this softwood material. Next, I could get the base mounted to the solid core door top, but first I sanded the edges of the door to clean them up, because otherwise I would have sanded through the paint on the vise blocking if I had waited to do this later. After sanding, I got the base flipped over, okay, there we go, and positioned on the underside of the top, making sure the vise blocking was flush with the edge of the top. Once I had it in position, I clamped it in place to keep it from moving around, and then pre-drilled and countersunk holes for these monstrous 5-inch structural screws, which I used to mount the base to the top. Now, pocket holes would have been another great option here, but again, I was trying to keep the tools to a minimum here, so I went with these screws instead. I decided to go ahead and attach the vise while I had the bench upside down, and I went with a simple 7-inch quick release vise from Rockler here. And these are extremely easy to install, and I just used more of the same structural screws to get it mounted.
Love a quick release vise. Okay. God, that's heavy.
With that done, the bench was ready to flip right side up, which was definitely easier said than done considering how heavy it was getting.
It's good. Oh, collapse. Jeez.
And as you can see, I built this entire project with the solid core door up on some sawhorses, no workbench required. And building a workbench before you actually have a workbench is one of the hardest things when you're getting started woodworking. And it's why I really like this style of bench rather than workbenches with laminated tops, since they're much harder to build with more limited tools.
Yes. That moves super smooth. It's a nice workbench. It's a heck of a lot nicer than the one I started with.
And if you wanted, you could stop here and have a great workbench. But I decided to take it a little further to really maximize both the work holding and storage capacity. So to really take the work holding options up a notch, I drilled a series of dog holes in the top of the bench, and this is one of the easiest ways to add functionality to an existing workbench. And a lot of people go nuts with their dog holes, turning their workbenches into wooden Swiss cheese. But I like to be much more conservative with my dog holes, since every one of these holes is a spot where small parts, screws, and sawdust can fall through. To drill the holes, I used this drilling guide and 3/4-inch auger bit, and it made quick work of drilling the holes. After drilling, I chamfered the dog holes, which will help keep the holes from chipping out with use, and then I could move on to making the vise chops. So one of the downsides of this style of vise are the relatively small metal jaws. And an easy way to improve the vise holding capacity and also keep your tools away from the metal jaws is to make a set of wooden chops, which are attached to the vise jaws. Generally speaking, you want your vise chops flush with your workbench top, so I cut a few scraps of maple to size and then whipped up a quick routing template so I could recess the metal jaws into the chops.
Ow. And try to avoid gluing your finger to your jig.
I used a template bit to route out the recessed area, and as you can see, this not only makes the vise look nicer, it also keeps your vise from sticking out as far from the edge of the bench. I repeated the process for the other chop and then got them cut to final size, cross-cutting them at the table saw and ripping them with my track saw. I flushed up the chops with the bench top with a low angle jack plane, and even without anything on the bottom shelf, the bench had almost no movement while planing. It was super stable. I wrapped up the chops by chamfering the edges and drilling some mounting holes. Then I could get them installed and test out the improved vise, and as expected, the vise worked great. I added another dog hole to the top of the outer chop, and this will allow me to hold pieces flat to the surface of the workbench, which allows for easy access to the entire surface of your workpiece. With that, the chops were done, and next I could get the top prepped for finish, starting by rounding the corners, which is yet another spot to bang into while working. I got the entire top sanded with 120 grit and then removed the vise chops for finishing. And I personally like to use up leftover finishes on chop projects, and since I've had this can of polyacrylic hanging around for years, it was my choice for this project. I also like how these water-based polyurethanes keep the birch top and maple chops from yellowing as much as oil-based polys do. I rolled on a few coats, making sure to also finish the underside of the top to keep it from warping. And once the finish had dried, I reinstalled the chops and added some rubberized cork to make the holding power even better. With that, the workbench itself was done, but as I mentioned, I wanted to add some storage to the bench, which meant building a cabinet for the bottom shelf area. I broke down my plywood pieces for the cabinet, along with the drawers, with a combination of my track saw and table saw. And once the pieces were cut to size, I could cut some grooves in the cabinet sides and dividers. And these grooves, in tandem with the oversized drawer bottoms, will act as the drawer runners, and building the cabinet in this way eliminates the need for drawer slides. That being said, it also means the drawers are much trickier to build, plus they won't be able to fully extend and won't slide quite as smoothly, so I'd consider whether saving about $100 on drawer slides is worth those trade-offs. Anyway, I cut the grooves into the pieces, and once that was done, I could move on to assembling the cabinet, and I did this without the assistance of a brad nailer, which unfortunately wasn't on my essential tools list, but this really wasn't that bad with the help of a few clamps. After installing the cabinet sides, I got the dividers installed using a few plywood scraps as spacers to keep the dividers in place while clamping. I got all the dividers installed and then added the cabinet top before finishing by installing the cabinet back. With the cabinet assembled, I could test the drawer bottoms and the grooves, and they seemed to be working great, and I also checked everything for square, and thankfully the cabinet was pretty much dead on. Since the cabinet back will be visible on the finished workbench, I decided to go ahead and add some wood filler prior to painting. Once the wood filler dried, I sanded the cabinet up to 120 grit, also chamfering the edges while I was at it, and then I rolled on a few coats of that same Makita teal. While the paint dried, I got to work on the drawers, and I started by assembling the sides, front, and back of the drawers with some 1¼ screws. And this was simple enough with some clamping, but I also wanted to illustrate just how much efficiency could be gained with the assistance of a few pin nails, and this eliminated the need for any clamping. After assembly, I sanded the drawer boxes, breaking any sharp edges, and then it was time to install the drawer bottoms. So as I mentioned, these drawers were quite a bit trickier than your typical drawer boxes since the drawer bottom needed to overhang the sides pretty precisely. I had to mark a bunch of layout lines on the drawer bottoms so I could accurately align the drawer box with the drawer bottoms, and this was made even more difficult since I decided these drawer bottoms could probably use some glue to help strengthen them.
There we've got our assembled drawer box.
Thankfully, this got easier after I got my order of operations down. I repeated the process on all 12 drawers, and once the glue had dried, I could do a test fit, and overall, things were fitting nicely. That said, I still needed to do a little tweaking here and there since there is a lot of variability in the fit between the grooves cut in the sides, the actual size of the drawer bottoms, and the exact positioning of the cabinet sides and dividers. The tweaking was easy enough with some sanding and a block plane, and there was also something really satisfying about getting all of these drawers fitting perfectly. After I got the drawers tuned up, I could cut the false fronts to size from some maple plywood, and I spent a little time during the layout process to make sure I ended up with a continuous grain pattern across all of the drawer fronts. I got the drawer fronts to final length at the table saw, and I really need to build a little crosscut sled for this saw for operations like this. Once the drawer fronts were cut to size, I chamfered the edges with my trim router, and then I could get them installed on the drawers using 1-inch screws from the inside of the drawer boxes.
There we go.
I repeated the process to install all 12 drawer fronts, and once that was done, I could remove the drawers and get the cabinet installed on the bottom shelf. Next, I needed to prep this mountain of drawers for finish, sanding away any pencil marks and breaking any other sharp edges before adding a few coats of water-based polyurethane to the drawer fronts. Once the finish dried, I got some grippy material added to the inside of the smaller drawers to keep things from moving around, installed some drawer pulls, and added some paste wax to the drawer runners before getting the drawers reinstalled in the bench. And with that, all that was left to do with the bench was stare at it, as my buddy Seth would say. Honestly, this workbench turned out better than I ever expected considering the limited tool set I used to build it, and I honestly think I could replace my fancy Roubo style bench with this workbench and be completely satisfied. Again, if you want to see a deep dive on all the details of this workbench, along with my essential tool list and an upcoming modern coffee table build, I'd love for you to check out my first woodworking course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. And as I mentioned, my course is in early access until June 14th, with the price reduced by 50%. So if you want to grab my course at the cheapest price it'll ever be, check it out by clicking the link in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, and until next week, happy building.